Thanks to everyone who's made this symposium possible, the organizers and of course the participants. The papers have been fascinating, so I look forward to hearing the rest of them and learning more from everyone who's presenting. So to begin, my topic's perhaps a little bit different to those that have presented thus far, in that I'm focusing on the historical reception of texts and contextualizing the place and standing of their authors, rather than engaging in the principles and discourse surrounding the kind of application of Maqasid. So this is because my main aim is to show a slightly different perspective on Maqasid, one that sees it integrated within the existing Usuli intellectual tradition, rather than increasingly stepping outside of it, as has happened since the early 20th century. So first of all, a brief overview of the kind of standard narrative we've all heard and even probably taught regarding Maqasid in our classroom environment. So it's often claimed that Muhammad Abduh revived this once dead science of Maqasid al-Shari'a. His students, in fact, have explicitly acknowledged his influence on them in investigating and publishing in this area. It's generally noted in a kind of response to a narrative of stagnation and decline due to taqlid, requiring ijtihad to make Islam compatible with modernity through focusing on its spirit rather than the letter. And this, it's said that Abduh revived by discovering this lost branch of knowledge through his own unearthing of the Muwafaqat of Shatibi. So what I attempt to demonstrate in this paper is that far from being lost, Shatibi's text and contribution to this discipline was essentially alive and actually a living tradition. So not merely at the time of Shatibi himself, but continued through the works of his students and later scholars. And it was, in fact, both contemporary to and slightly preceding Abduh's discovery of this, as my current focus on the Mauritanian Maliki jurists, i.e. scholars within the madhab that Shatibi himself belonged to, hopefully demonstrates. So as we're probably all aware, Shatibi's Muwafaqat was printed for the first time in Tunis in 1884, which is approximately 500 years after his death. Now, even back in my undergrad days, learning of Islamic Law 101 and its history, this was one of the key areas of concern for me. It was 500 years. What happened between those two periods? And regardless of where I looked and what I read, it's not something I could ever find an answer to or even probe more deeply until recently. So kind of with that in mind, and as a kind of larger methodological background for framing my presentation and research, we have to bear in mind that the act of editing and printing these types of texts has never been kind of accorded any role in the writing of histories within our field. Works kind of appear out of nowhere for us to use as if they're from the ether or something like that. So likewise, the process of writing commentaries or super commentaries, so shuru al-hawashi, on texts, rather than writing standalone works, has been little discussed in our field until very recently. So for example, most commonly brief mention is made of a rhyming abridgment of Muwafaqat by one of Shatibi's students before jumping to Muhammad Abduh, Rashid Rida, and the likes of Ibn Ashur or Abu Zahra in the 20th century. So on opening works related to the development of Maqasid, we find statements such as, quote, I did not find anyone after Shatibi who conducted independent Maqasid research until Ibn Ashur came, end quote, which rests on a number of assumptions. Not least is the fact that absence of evidence does not mean evidence of absence, as hopefully we shall see in the rest of my presentation. And this type of quote, symptomatic of the trend. Both Western academia and much of the research in the Arab and Muslim world largely relegates any texts which are not judged to be independent research to basically mere footnotes, at least the closer we get to the modern period. So, studies of the pre-modern period commonly make use of these as primary sources. So, however, it's this area that's crucial, as it's where we find an organic Maliki approach engaging Shatibi's work and the theory of Maqasid from the 1800s and early 1900s via both abridgments and commentaries on his work and that of his student, Abu Bakr ibn Asim. So this is within a wider discourse in our field that is looking at the commentary tradition and its role in the wider Islamic intellectual heritage. Okay, so begin talking about Abu Bakr ibn Asim, who's well known to anyone who studies the Maliki madhab. So he was the Qari al-Jama'a in his time, and he studied under a number of important teachers, including al-Shatibi. So Ibn Asim had a number of important students who later became scholars in their own right, such as al-Mawaqi, whose commentary in Mukhtasar Khalil in fiqh remains a mainstay of the Maliki method to this day. People still study it. His brother Abu Yahya ibn Asim, who predeceased him, was actually considered the inheritor of Shatibi's thought and works and is noted for his responses to those scholars who criticized Shatibi. So, and as anyone who knows who's looked into the history of Shatibi's life, he received a considerable amount of criticism from some of his students even, as well as his peers. Numerous writings have been attributed to Ibn Asim. He's most widely known for his work on judgeship or qada with his Tuhfat al-Hukam. And among his excellent works are 2 rhyming texts in Usul al-Fiqh and an abridgment of Shatibi's Muwafaqat, which are the main concern here. So these are all mentioned in biographical notes about him, but have received little attention academically. Ahmed Raisuni notes that Ibn Asim refined and summarized Shatibi's text, whilst another of Shatibi's students, he literally says Talamiz Akhir, made a rhyming version of it. So this seems to have been based on the comments of the modern editor of Shatibi's published fatwa collection, whilst earlier authorities such as Ahmed Baba at-Timbukti in his Nail al-Ibtihaj explicitly note that Ibn Asim's abridgment is a rajis or a rhyming text like his other works, including the Tuhfa. A recent commentary on this text based on its single surviving manuscript in Spain gives 10 pages of the introduction to authenticate its direct attribution to Ibn Asim, wherein the commentator notes the similarities between Nail al-Muna and Ibn Asim's other well-known text on Usul al-Fiqh, which is known as Murtaqal al-Wusul, both in terms of the content, but also the structure and the vocabulary used. And it's this latter text that I'm concerned with here. So Ibn Asim's Murtaqal al-Wusul is considered one of his later texts, and it's the shorter of his 2 rhyming usul texts, having only 850 lines compared to the 1,000 in the former. He places a section on Maqasid al-Shari'a near the beginning of Murtaqal al-Wusul, occupying 27 verses of the 850 total. He places it between his discussion on the different categories of rulings, such as talking about the azima and rukhsa and so on, and the discussion of legal responsibility or taklif. So this placement shows that although Shatibi is known to have been criticized by authorities in Granada in his time, the principles of Maqasid that had developed up until his time, and also via his own work, were placed into the wider context within Usul al-Fiqh by Ibn Asim. They were not treated as a radical break with the existing legal theory or the legal schools. So as far as can be ascertained at this time, neither of Ibn Asim's Usul al-Fiqh texts received any older commentaries based on existing manuscript evidence, even though they're all noted under all the biographical information in dictionaries tarajum about him until the present. So that is until the late 18th century, a full century before Muhammad Abdu rediscovered Shatibi's Muwafaqat. So I mentioned Muhammad Yahya al-Walati, who died in 1912 in this talk first, rather than in my paper where I mentioned him last, basically just for flow. And this is because he's the linchpin connecting between the past and the present. So both Hama'ullah al-Ghalawi's commentary preceding Walati and Muhammad Fowles afterwards, that I'll discuss shortly, are indebted to him for posterity. So either mention of its mate and aspects are included in Walati's own work, or the commentary after Walati builds upon it and interacts with his writing. So Walati comes from a noted ulama family from the town of Walata in southeastern Mauritania, which has a noted madrasa system dating back over 400 years. In his time, biographical dictionaries note that if you're talking about Walata and use the title al-Faqih, then without exception, Muhammad Yahya al-Walati is intended. And he's widely known in the region due to his expansive range of written works, as well as his 7-year journey for Hajj. And he actually wrote a travelogue called the Rihla al-Hijaziyya, all about his journey and what happened on the way. So Walati is routinely given numerous accolades and titles, you know, as I'm sure we've all heard, al-Alama, al-Usuli, al-Fahama, and so on. And he's even called the seal of the verifiers, so Khatam al-Muhaqqiqin. His range of texts is prolific, but his major focus is in the related realms of Usul al-Fiqh and legal maxims, so Qawaid Fiqhiyya, ranging from the novice level text to the most advanced in the Maliki method. So of note here is that he wrote his commentary Fath al-Wadud on the well-known Maraki al-Saud, which is the relied on latter-day text in Maliki Usul al-Fiqh. He completed it in 1872. He then wrote BULUGH al-Sul, his commentary on Ibn Asim, completing it in 1874. So both of these were actually published within his lifetime in Morocco in 1910, a couple of years before he passed, edited by Muhammad Habibullah al-Shinqiti, who's a well-known hadith scholar and was later based in Al-Azhar for the latter part of his life. So Walati also wrote a commentary on the versification of the Warqat of Imam al-Juwayni, a detailed rhyming text and commentary on the legal maxims of the Maliki school, as well as a commentary on Sahih al-Bukhari. So in other words, he was quite prolific in his output. It was actually via my ongoing research on Walati that a curious note piqued my interest. at the beginning of his commentary on Ibn Asim's text. So in listing the sources that he relied on in his own commentary, Walati states regarding a text known as Tura that it is not ascribed to anyone, but I think it's from Abdullah ibn Ahmed ibn al-Hajj Hama'allah al-Ghalawi. So the editor of Untitled Usul, the recent edition of it, notes that it's perhaps the earliest commentary on the text, though it's now lost, besides the mention of it and contents preserved by Walati. As Ibn Asim's text was restricted and mostly taught in the madrasa system in Mauritania via sessions of listening, because it's a rhyming text rather than via commentaries. So Walati also notes beside that he uses the Qawaid of Abi Ishaq al-Shatibi as a source. So a text on Usul al-Fiqh by this name is nowhere to be found in any of the biographical literature for Shatibi. However, Ahmed Baba Timbukti mentions in relation to him that he has derived, set down and verified legal principles, i.e. Qawaid, and the commentary of Maraki as-Saud by its author, Abdullah ibn al-Hajj Ibrahim al-Alawi, who died 1818, explains the term Muwafiq in one of his verses as meaning Qawaid. So at this stage, you can kind of posit that Walati here is referring to Muwafaqat. And I note this because Walati then mentions that he relies on both the Qawaid of Shatibi and the Mukhtasar al-Usuli of Ibn al-Hajib, but does not have them with him. He literally says he doesn't have them with him when he's writing this commentary. So he transmits what's conveyed by Abdullah, i.e. al-Ghalawi, in what he transmits from them, basically if Walati agrees with them. So at this stage alone, Walati tantalizingly hints at the possibility that Shatibi's Muwafaqat was known in Mauritania by 1794, if not before, almost a full century before Muhammad Abdul became aware of its existence. So when we begin analyzing the text itself, this becomes even more apparent. So this part I've added since the submission of the paper. So noting here that I'm in the early stages of my doctoral research, technically first semester, first year, my preliminary analysis shows that Walati is directly quoting from Muwafaqat at numerous instances throughout the text, not just when discussing Maqasid, but also in the other areas that Shatibi's text actually covers, such as discussing ahkam, discussing qiyas, especially regarding tahqiq al-manat, which was previously mentioned in regards to Sheikh bin Baya, and so on. So sometimes it's solely a direct quote, but in other cases it's intermixed with a summary of Shatibi's discussion. So a paragraph or two might be subsumed into a sentence or two, which at this stage I can only assume was undertaken by Hama'allah al-Ghalawi in his earlier work and reproduced by Walati, because he basically just says qala al-Shatibi, so as if Shatibi is saying it. Walati places the quotes and summarization of Shatibi's points in a surrounding discussion of the topic with other standard Maliki luminaries in Usul al-Fiqh, such as al-Qarafi, Hululu, and Ibn al-Hajib, as well as other established sources such as as-Subki's Jama' al-Jawami', of which Maraki as-Saud is kind of seen as like a Maliki rendition of it. So as stated earlier, there are two other commentaries on Ibn Asim, one prior to Walati that he draws on, and the other that builds upon Walati's own work. So I'll just give a brief overview of these to kind of place him in the wider context. So the first one is Abdullah ibn Ahmed ibn al-Hajj al-Ghalawi, who died in 1794, according to the biographical dictionaries. So he's listed as a scholar par excellence, and it's noted that in the Haud region of southeast Mauritania, there was no one like him in his time. He produced a number of texts across all major areas of Islamic learning. He was noted as having, a high station in every discipline. If he gave a fatwa on an issue, it was accepted by the community, is what's recorded. So a text on Usul al-Fiqh mentioned in the biographical dictionaries, but without any further details as to its contents or its kind of provenance. So one of Hama'allah al-Ghalawi's main students was his nephew, Muhammad al-Nabigha, who died 1829. He was a noted jurist and legal thinker, and he's pretty much central to Mauritanian jurisprudence. He wrote an important text on finding the mu'tamad, or relied on opinion of the school for issuing fatwas, according to the Maliki sources, known as the Butlahiyya, which is still a mainstay for the madhab, even outside of that particular region. In it, there's a section on juristic preference, i.e. doing tarjih based on benefits or maslaha and preventing harms or mafasid. And this again shows how it was a standard attitude in Maliki Usul al-Fiqh, and all of this was used within an existing framework. After that, we skip forward a bit to Muhammad Fal ibn Baba ibn Ahmed Bayba al-Alawi al-Shanqiti, who died in 1930. So he's all of these guys are polymaths. It's incredible to see what they've written on. He was, a noted jurist, Sufi sheikh, and a historian. His Sharh of Untitled Usul is one of the things he's most well known for, followed by other texts in legal theory and aspects of Maliki fiqh. And he's also noted He has a Takmila fi al-Tarikh, which is covering recent Mauritanian history and biographical entries. And actually, it's a major source for the history of the region during the late 1800s and early 1900s, particularly. So it's interesting to note here that Ahmed Mazid al-Jekni, the Mauritanian editor of Ibn Asim's Untitled al-Usul, summarizes this text by stating that Muhammad Fal uses his discernment to explicitly link Murtakal al-Shatibi's Muwafaqat and other time, connecting it to the other Usuli texts as well. He also notes that Muhammad Fal stays very close to the structure and content found in the commentary of al-Walati. Now, since submitting this paper, just noting, I've actually located an edition of this text, but I think it may have literally been stuck in the Suez Canal. So I'm eagerly awaiting its arrival so I can actually do more analysis on it. Until then, I'm kind of just stuck with that interesting description. So this section is given an outline of 3 thus far little known Mauritanian commentaries on Ibn Asim's Murtakal al-Usul and their authors, in order to show that the reception of Shatibi's ideas on Maqasid and maslaha by his students' works was standard and not something that needed to be introduced to the region. And that's unlike the Islamic East, relatively speaking, where Muhammad Abdu and his students were all active. So all 3 authors, Al-Ghalawi especially, predate Muhammad Abdu's students popularizing Shatibi's Muwafaqat, and 2 of the commentaries on Ibn Asim also predate Abdu's rediscovery of Shatibi in Tunis. So with the time that's left, I'll turn to the Mauritanian works on the Muwafaqat directly. So the next full print of Muwafaqat was in 1923, so with multiple other editions continuing until today. But to date, there's been no detailed study surrounding any of the abridgments of Muwafaqat or their commentaries. And as mentioned before, they've been relegated to mere footnotes or sentences, brief sentences. So the first one is by al-Aynayn al-Qalqami, who died in 1910. And he's mostly known in the literature as an anti-colonial resistance leader against the French and Spanish forces, as well as due to his Sufism. He had a very large Sufi network in the region, but there's been little said about his intellectual output. So like the previous mentioned scholars, he was from a scholarly family, and there's been praise heaped on him of all sorts of things. He's recorded as having written between 100 and over 300 separate works. He undertook the pilgrimage to Mecca in 1858 and returned to Mauritania the next year. So he basically missed out. He was 25 years early in visiting Tunis compared to when Muwafaqat was printed. But he did actually establish relationships with the elites in that region, and he established a zawiya in the south of Morocco where he could begin teaching students. And it was also used as a base for his anti-colonial endeavors. And this is where he began producing texts for teaching. So al-Aynayn notes he first received a copy of Muwafaqat in 1889, so shortly after it was printed, and he wrote a rhyming abridgment of it that was completed in 1893. And he was later asked to provide explanation due to its complexities, which he called al-Murafiq al-Muwafiq. He completed it in 1905. So a detailed analysis of the contents of this needs to be completed. And again, it's early days in my study yet, but it's worth noting here that the text was printed in Fez during his lifetime in 1906. So the editor of the current edition explicitly states that it's the best of the abridgments, and that's by the early 2000s when this edition was published, and that he removes unnecessary digressions and provides clarification regarding Shatibi's terminology and overall stays close to the original text. The editor does note that there's sections where al-Aynayn mentions many Sufi escapades and fables, naturally due to his Sufi background. I'm circling back to Muhammad Yahya al-Walati in his later work in Shatibi's Muwafaqat here. So we saw in the previous section that in 1874, Walati was aware Shatibi had a text that he referred to as Qawaid, and noted he didn't have it in his possession. We also know he went on this famous Hajj pilgrimage that took about 7 years. And in his own account, he was gifted Muwafaqat around 1897, so shortly after the original printing of it in 1884. So his commentary on the Muwafaqat remains one of the largely unmentioned texts in standard biographical entries. The text was published under the auspices of his grandson, but thus far only 2 volumes have been printed, corresponding to the end of Kitab al-Maqasid in Shatibi's text. So in this work, he focuses solely on clarifying issues, literally tawdih al-mushkilat, while summarizing aspects of the text. Now, similar to al-Aynayn's approach, Walati summarizes the text and provides illustrative examples to help explain complex areas and topics. However, it's not a linear commentary by any means, unlike al-Aynayn. He also provides his own opinions when he feels they're needed, although deeper research needs to be undertaken to understand the exact nature of the relationship between Walati's approach to Maqasid and Shatibi himself. It's clear that both Walati and al-Aynayn'S have some Muwafaqat within the intellectual world they were already part of, and engage with Shatibi's work as part of the ongoing legal discourse. This is substantially different in approach to those who came after Rashid al-Rida, especially up until the contemporary period. This is because Maqasid was a standard topic of treatment within Usul al-Fiqh according to the Maliki tradition. It was already discussed in 1874 in Walati's commentary on Ibn Asim, and we can even see the familiar tripart division of Maqasid and its treatment of 6 universals and so on. Way back in 1800 in the commentary on Murafi'S Saud. So my point here is to show that engagement with Shatibi was a continuation of existing legal thought and not a radical break with what came before. And just looking at the time, so I'll conclude here. So as you can see, my brief paper is aiming to show a neglected area of historical research in terms of understanding Maqasid al-Shari'a and Islamic thought. It posits and hopefully at least begins to substantiate that Shatibi's work and ideas were known in Mauritania through the commentary tradition before Muhammad Abdu rediscovered the Muwafaqat in Tunis, leading to an explosion of research and work from his followers, which we all know about until today. I included a brief diagram there to try and give a timeline to show that there was a lot of activity between when Muwafaqat was printed in Tunis and when it was reprinted in Egypt by Abdul's students, as well as the connection through Ibn Asim before that. So I'll just finish there because I'm just looking at the time. All right, so thank you very much, everyone.